in weekend mode. So
Amazing. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying something, Dr. Aaron.
no, I said I'm in weekend mode, so I'm in no rush.
Amazing, amazing. Thanks. Thank you. So I think we have a sizable number to start, about 12 of us here. I have a quick introduction to give, and I'm sure while I do that, yeah, a few more people will join in before we pass this on to our moderator, Doctor, and to take us through today's conversation. So if you just give me a sec, I'll be sharing
Sure.
my screen. Just confirm if you can see my screen. You can? Okay, cool. Amazing. Thanks. Thank you so much, everyone. For those who might be joining us for the first time, and just apologies, I'm not sure if you can hear this. There's construction going on not too far from my house, so there might be a couple of loud screams. But
Can't hear anything. Not so far anyway.
amazing. Thanks. So just for those who might be joining us for the first time, you're welcome to the Rivers 2050 Vision platform. The Rivers 2050 Vision is a visioning project led by policy shapers, and my name is Ebenezer Awikina. I'm the founder of Policy Shapers and the convener of this project. Just a quick info as to what motivated us to start this and what our mission is. So the last time our state had a long-term vision was 50 years ago. This was a time when we had our first governor back in 1975, who actually, funny enough, was in his 20s. And since then, we've never had a young a young person lead the state. But yeah, this was about 50 years ago. All of these are like symbols of our states, whether it's from the bureaucracy and the civil service that was built to the West Africa Glass Company and the Reason Palm. All of the things that still stand till today were built 50 years ago. And as good as that was, we feel like the state got into a sort of like a loop of short-term thinking, got stuck in toxic politics and short-term thinking that's held us back and hasn't given us the kind of growth that the state has the potential to achieve. And so that's part of what inspired us to say if the government wouldn't do it, maybe the citizens should do it. Maybe as young people, we should organize ourselves and work on what we think should be the manifesto for our generation for the next 25 years. And bring together the experts, whether it's internationally, as we're doing today, or even nationally, to come advise and give us sort of like guidance on how we can work around this. So yeah, so the Rivers 2050 Vision book will be launched in November this year in Port Harcourt in River State. And yeah, we hope that to be a guide for the next 25 years. It's going to feature uh, people's voices, community ideas, policy pathways, sort of advice to political class, insights from experts on the 15 thematic areas that we've identified as the areas that the state needs to grow in over the next couple of decades. So we designed the project into 5 phases. We've completed the first 3 phases. The first phase was basically bringing young people together. We've convened over 150 young people from across the states to lead the vision because the idea of embedding futures thinking and foresight into this is that we don't want this to be an individual's vision, which is what is often the case in Nigeria. And so we brought a couple of young people together from across in diaspora and also across the states to be able to lead this vision. And many of them are here on this call, and you get to meet them. We've also been able to survey now up to 4,000 plus people, citizens across the state as a second phase, because again, if the vision is citizen-led and citizen-driven, citizens' voices need to feature the most in it. And so we've gone across to talk about like what are their current living conditions, where the needs are across local government areas, and basically what needs to happen, like what solutions are needed over the next decade plus to be able to solve the problems that they see around them. The third phase, which is what's part of what we're doing here, we're doing this for the past 1 year. We've been hosting focus group discussions and key informal interviews with, of course, local partners, local experts across the 15 thematic areas, plus also international partners as well. We had a conversation last year with someone from the Qatar Foundation to speak about how Qatar sort of like embeds foresight and futures thinking in its work. And so we're happy today to also hear from Singapore as well. So for the first 3 phases, we're almost done with the FGDs. By next month, we should be wrapping up all of the FGDs. The survey is at 4,000 plus people. We're aiming to hit 5,000 plus, and we'll close this out by maybe middle of next month. And then all the efforts then go into the fourth phase, which is bringing all that data together and synthesizing everything to form the vision book. And then the launch is slated for Q4 2026. All the information from the project is on the website as well, and also on YouTube. So those who join, or those who might join for the first time, can find all that information here as well. So three big questions, just before I hand over to Dr. Anne. Three big things we want to learn today from uh, Dr. Maniam. I think sort of like three things that we've seen that Singapore does really well, and it will be good to hear his insights as well on all of these things. The first is that how has Singapore innovated against scarcity? Folks might not know this, but River State is about 7 times the size of Singapore. So Singapore's landmass is about 744 kilometers square. River State is 11,000 kilometers square. So you think about the potential for industrial growth and agriculture and everything, but we have a huge food security problem despite this vast potential, right? So I mean, Singapore doesn't have, I'm sure if they had as much land as us, they would be much more bigger and have achieved a lot more, right? And so the question would be, how have they been able to basically use the resources that they have, the scarce land mass that they have to sort of like build the kind of cities that they've been able to build? The second is, how has Singapore insulated its vision from political disruption? I think this is quite key because for most of Nigeria and across Africa as well, right from the time of Lee Kuan Yew, I mean, there's been a vision for Singapore that has continued up until today. So how have you done this? Because we really want to know. And this is one of the biggest issues that we think the vision book would face post launch. So this is something that we'll be happy to hear about. I think the third, and I think Dr. Maniam is really like positioned to talk about this, is how can we really build public service capacity? We think that the quality of leadership that we get, or that we've gotten over the past couple of decades, sort of like speaks to why we are, as a state, quite stagnant. So how do we build capacity, like intentionally build capacity for public service and ensure that some of the lessons he learned from his work at the Center for Strategic Futures sort of like feeds into what we're trying to do here in River State? Okay, so I just read his bio quickly and then I'll pass this on to Dr. Anne to take us through to this conversation. Dr. Aaron Maniam, this is a very short version of his bio. I'm sure you can find a longer version on the University of Oxford website. But Dr. Aaron Maniam's work at the University of Oxford focuses on issues connecting technology, public policy, and public administration. He lectures the Master of Public Policy and Executive Education programs at the university, and he had previously worked as a policymaker at the Singapore government. He was most recently Deputy Secretary, Industry and International at the Singapore Ministry of Communications and Information. Before that, he served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Industry, the Public Service Commission, as well as the Civil Service College as well. He was the founding head of Singapore's Center for Strategic Futures, currently under the Prime Minister's Office Strategy Group, and also worked as Institute Director of the Institute of Public Sector Leadership. In both roles, he was involved in conceptualizing, facilitating, delivering and sustaining cross-government strategy, visioning, leadership development, and organizational development efforts. He holds a PhD, MPP, and BA from Oxford and an MA from Yale University. And this is, again, like I said, to mention a few, because there's so many more things about him. So thank you so much, Dr. Aaron, for giving us the time and just like being willing to come share your insights to us. I'll hand over now to Dr. Anne Briggs-Famuyiwa, who's our moderator, and Bira, who is our rapporteur for today's session.
Okay, hi. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. Aaron. So I've read through your bio and I'm super impressed. So there's some form of like, I don't know what to call it, but I'm impressed you're here. Thank you. Good afternoon. So let's take it away quickly.
Great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's okay. So tell us a bit about the arc of your career from the Singapore civil service to Oxford. What motivated you to get into public service in Singapore, and how would you compare that to your experience? How would you compare that experience with your current work in academia? Did you hear me, sir?
I can hear you, and thank you very much. And thanks also to Ebenezer for that very kind introduction earlier. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I love what you're trying to do. I think it's extremely important work, and whatever I can do to encourage it, I'm happy to try. So you asked Anne about my career, right? Can I just check, is the audio okay? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, great. Great, because I have to say, the 5G network in the UK is not always as good as it should be. It's a developing infrastructure, shall we say, in a lot of ways. The so you asked about my career, right? You're right. I started in public service, and one of the biggest reasons I wanted to do that was I realized along the way that I wanted a career that was quite multifaceted. I like to write, and so at one point someone said to me that I should be maybe think about being a journalist. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't just want to write for its own sake. I do enjoy it, and I write poetry in my free time, which feeds into a lot into my futures and how I imagine the world. But I don't want to do that. I wanted to do a job that paid my salary, but that wasn't just about me, And I found after some thinking about it that the public service was really the best place to do that kind of other-centered work. I began as a diplomat, actually, because I've always really enjoyed the process of building up, you're building up one's country, representing it. But I did find after a while that much as I enjoyed that, and I had a posting in Washington, D.C., for instance, I was also interested in how the broader government machinery works. I wasn't just interested in the international policy aspects. And that's what drew me to the work of Foresight. Back then, there was no CSF. So when I joined the Public Service Division, at the time, they were doing a lot of scenario planning out of an outfit called the Strategic Policy Office, but the CSF as an entity did not exist. And we can talk more later about why we added it to the toolkit that we have. But yeah, the basic reasoning behind government was that I wanted to do something that was other-centered. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized what a privilege to work in a place like Singapore, right, which is dealing with, in a lot of ways, the cutting edge of governance challenges. I thought about being a consultant at one point, but then I realized that if I joined something like McKinsey or Accenture, then I'll be solving yesterday's problems. Whereas Singapore is thinking a lot about today's problems and tomorrow's problems. And that struck me as quite interesting as well. And then the last aspect is that I was on a program where I was moving around different parts of government, and I knew that there was a built-in diversity into that work. Whereas I think if you do other sorts of jobs, sometimes you end up getting deep into one area, and there's nothing wrong with that. The deep expertise is very valuable, but it's not how my mind works. My mind works in quite a pluralistic way, and I find that I like to be able to do many different things and then draw connections across them. So I've enjoyed that process very much. And you mentioned that I've made a change now, right, into academia. So I teach at the school that you see behind me here on my backdrop. That's the Blavatnik School, and we've had wonderful students from Nigeria actually, every cohort. So hopefully some of you can come join that group at some point. Um, I don't actually think of the move to Blavatnik as a career shift, actually. I'm still working on policy issues. I still work with policymakers. The two biggest differences are that now, in addition to doing policy, which I still do via advisory work and kind of projects for different governments, I also get to teach about it, which is really fun because it means I get to work with people who are eager to learn and who want to be curious about the world. Um, that's one big difference. The other is, of course, that I don't just get to work on one government anymore. I get to share what Singapore has done with other parts of the world, sometimes in direct form, sometimes in an indirect way, because Singapore is also small, right? As you pointed out, Evan, we're only 744 kilometers, and so there are both challenges that come from that size, but also certain opportunities. And so not everything can be transplanted from Singapore, but there are principles I think that can apply. So I do enjoy the teaching process. But other than that, I think of myself as still doing very much public sector work. I'm helping public sectors get better, and I'm helping them to improve the techniques that they apply. So if you like I think of my circle as widening a little bit, but the core of it is still about public policy work.
Okay, very interesting. And the fact that you get to now get into other governments and give advisory, so that's really nice. So Singapore started its future thinking in the late 80s. However, a lot of Singapore's future is shaped by the late Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of modern Singapore.
Yeah.
What was the original insight that made the government invest in long-term planning so early? So
Yeah.
what was the catch? What made them invest so early?
Yeah. And I'm really glad you asked that, Anne, because Lee Kuan Yew was great, right? And very important in our history. But I don't think the long-term planning came just from him. He was a very natural scenario thinker, and he could think about different possibilities in a very seamless way. People like him did not need futures methodologies, because they think about the future in a very, very seamless, organic manner. But I would also say that a lot of why Singapore does this work is not just because of one man. It's because of how we became a country. I mean, we had been colonized by the British, then we were subject to the Japanese occupation um, during World War II, and the Japanese occupation, especially, I think, reminded us how geostrategically vulnerable we are, right? That we can be conquered at any point, even when defended by a large power like the British. And that reminded us how precarious geopolitics also is, because established powers can get upended, right? And they can be challenged by new ones, as the US is seeing with China now. What we also realized along the way, once we left the Malaysian Federation, and there are many different versions of history here. Some people say we got kicked out, some say we left. Recent evidence actually suggested that we wanted to leave, in that at least the minister who was in charge of negotiating with the Malaysians, he actually felt that our future was better off on our own. Lee Kuan Yew did not think so. Lee Kuan Yew thought that we should stay in the Malaysian Federation because we're very small and don't have natural markets of our own. So anyway, thank goodness that we sent the minister who did go to the negotiation. So he found a way to get us out relatively gracefully. Um, and I think that is probably the single greatest reason why we do futures the way we do, and why we're paranoid, right? And just utterly obsessed with the long-term future, because we're vulnerable. Right? We're a small country that is always vulnerable. And more recent history has kind of borne that out, right? I mean, we became a country suddenly. We have gone through many different crises along the way, and whenever something happens globally, right, whether it's the collapse of the USSR or the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the events of 9/11, SARS and COVID, the global financial crisis of 2009, now the crisis with the Straits of Hormuz, all of those things have deep repercussions on us, right? We are an open economy, we're very small, and we get affected by those things, right? Through no mistakes of our own, we have to deal with the fact that oil prices are going up, right? Or that there will be issues between our Muslim community and other communities because of imported culture wars. So we've realized this, that we're very vulnerable, right? And Lee Kuan Yew, of course, understood that, but so did other people in his generation. And so I think more than just one man, the story of why we do futures the way we do is because we're always vulnerable, and we've realized it. And so we are what my friend Peter Schwartz, who used to work on futures at the Global Business Network and now works at Salesforce. He used to say that Singapore is a nation of worriers, right? But we're also what he calls the apple of nations. So we're worrying, but we try and use the resources that we have in order to achieve the best outcomes that are possible. And I will add that this acute sense of vulnerability is something that actually many successful foresight ecosystems have. Right? When countries do foresight, it's often because there is some perceived urgency and vulnerability that they have to deal with. The Finns are another very mature foresight ecosystem, right, in Finland, and they have the constant and existential threat of a large neighbor, right next to them that they have to deal with. And when they saw how fast Nokia collapsed, in the world of smartphones, I think they also saw how vulnerable they always would be. The Estonians similarly have a large Russian neighbor. The Dutch are constantly thinking about flooding and being literally overwhelmed by water, right? So I think you'll find that many systems that do this work well have a fundamental strategic drive of vulnerability awareness.
Wow. So this is the first time I'm hearing that being vulnerable can be a good thing. That is interesting.
I mean, you can't change the world, right? So you have to work with the world that is there. Well, you can change parts of the world, is what I would say, but you also have to work with what's there. And in our case, we can't change the fact that we are vulnerable. And so we've had to try and make the most of what we do have, which is, a good geographical location at the crossroads of major trading routes. We've got a pretty decent population willing to work hard. We have diversity, which we've turned into an advantage. Because it could be the source of great communal strife, but we've also found ways to try and to make that ethnic diversity a source of strength, because it means that the folks like me can help deal with India, the Chinese majority can deal with China. All of us speak English coming out of our colonial past, and so we all can engage with the world wherever possible. All of that adds up, I think, but it comes from vulnerability, right? I'm not a pessimist, but I know that there are certain realities that Singapore faces which we cannot run away from, including the fact that we are tiny and therefore have to really learn to take care of ourselves.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. Wow. Toxic future and politics has been a barrier to growth in River State and across Nigeria at large. How has Singapore insulated its vision and foresight from the unpredictability of politics? And how would you ensure that, regardless of who wins the election, the vision stays supreme?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and my honest answer, and this is all Chatham House, right? I mean, you're not going to quote me directly on things, yeah. Um, I am not sure that we have done that. I'll tell you why. We've had the same party in power since 1965. We don't know what will happen if a different party comes to power. They might stop the futures vote. I hope they won't. And I'll tell you why I hope they won't, but they might, so I don't know. And it is true that in many instances, politics can be a challenge, right? Because in the UK, for example, they used to have a very mature foresight ecosystem, and then through changes between Labour and the Conservative Party, a lot of that got destroyed. They've had to recreate it from scratch now. Thankfully, they've kept some of it, going in the Cabinet Office and in parts of the Defence Ministry. But a lot of the core capabilities, which were excellent in the early 2000s, are now gone. We learned from them, and then we set up the CSF, and then later, 10 years from then, they said to us, "Can you teach us what you do?" And I'm like, "But we learned from you." And I actually told some people who asked me those questions, I said, "You should go read the notes of all the meetings that we had. I'm sure they're there." And they said, "No, all of those institutional knowledge has been destroyed because once the government changed hands from at that point from Labour to Conservative, many of those records got destroyed." Very unfortunate, right, in a lot of ways. So politics can be toxic, it's true. Um, what we've tried to do so far is to not make the politicians feel that good futures is somehow oppositional to their position. We interview them, right? We involve them in conversations. Not in every project for the opposition, right? Because there is a ruling party and we serve their mandate as civil servants. But we try and involve people where possible. There's a lot of deliberative processes where sometimes opposition politicians do get invited. And so they also feel that they're part of that. And what we've tried to frame the futures as doing is never partisan, right? We don't write anything partisan about it. We will not study the future of the People's Action Party, which is the dominant party, not as a civil service. They can do their own futures, that's fine, right? But we would not do that within the civil service. So the output is very much Singapore focused, right? As a country, as a national entity, and as an ecosystem. So if one day, a different party wins, then they should be able to read that material and still see themselves in it, right? And see that their vision could be relevant because the scenarios don't set out a vision, right? They're not a political manifesto, in that we've not committed to things that are the purview of an elected parliament and an elected government. We are setting out ideas there that are the strategic realities and the contours and parameters of what Singapore's reality is. With that framing, my hope really is that it will not be subject to politics. But like I said, this is an untested hypothesis as well as an untested hope. I wish that I hope that I'm right, but I really wouldn't know. And at least I think for the next 10 years or so, I think we will not test that hypothesis because our strongest opposition party has quite clearly said they do not want to run the government. They want to focus on a few seats. They want to have about maybe a quarter of the seats in parliament, and that's what they're interested in. They want to be a good opposition. They don't want to run the government. So I don't think we're facing any imminent leadership transition. But who knows what happens after that, right? Anything can take place, given how unstable both international and national politics is. Yeah, so that
Well,
might not have been the answer you wanted, Anne, because I don't know if I can give you a silver bullet. Yeah,
one size fits all. So this is also interesting. Like you have an opposition that doesn't want to seize power.
yeah.
Wow. Okay. That is interesting.
Yeah, they've
Okay.
said they want to be a first world opposition. They don't want to seize power. And I can't say I blame them. Seizing power is hard. I mean, governing is very, very difficult, as many people know, right? And so I think it's actually quite sensible. If their aim is to be a good check and balance, and that's their aim. And they can keep doing that then without destabilizing the fundamental structures that are in place to keep Singapore going, because we are quite vulnerable. Yeah.
So I'm thinking it's basically their mindsets because the Nigerian in me is thinking otherwise, but that's okay. How did Singapore build a culture of foresight and not just within the government, but across society? What role do citizens play? We ask this because the Rivers 2050 vision is
Yeah.
citizen led,
Yes.
and we'd like to learn how citizens can lead future thinking.
Yeah. Again, here there may be a slightly unexpected reply. So Singapore does really, really good work on civil service foresight, right? Foresight in what I would call the executive branch of government. Our parliament is not very involved in foresight, certainly not the way Finland and Estonia's parliaments are involved. We don't have a process, which mandates a discussion of a government report by both parliament as well as the prime minister's office, for example. So it is a very, very civil service focused system, an executive focused system. We've had a few examples of citizen-led foresight, led by a think tank in particular called the Institute of Policy Studies. And they've done 2 rounds of scenarios that they call the PRISM scenarios, which have really engaged with a range of different people. The civil service scenarios include input from a range of folks, right? Through workshops, for example, a bit like your consultative focus group sessions that Ebenezer described. But I won't say that they are led by civil society, whereas your process is led by civil society, and we involve folks in workshops. But I won't say it's a fundamentally participatory process because it's not like there are 500 workshops and people can sign up for any one of them. It's a few workshops that go into, and the input includes the ideas that come from the citizens, but they are there as part of just broader national consultative processes. So I actually wouldn't describe our process as very participatory. I think that's something we should work on actually and do better. So there are a small group of folks who are trying to build up the civil society capacity. There's a little group called the Futures Collective, for example, which just looking up on Telegram now, how many people there are in it. It's not super small, but it's not the biggest thing in the world. Oh, actually, no. There's 175 people in the Futures Collective, so they get together once or twice, a month, just to exchange notes on what they're doing in civil society. So some of them are teachers, some are in universities, but the bulk of them are not government folks, and they're trying to build up this capacity. But this is very new, right? It's only existed for the last maybe I would say between 5 and 10 years in different ways. The most mature part of Singapore's system is very much the executive-led system. But I think this is one of the areas you're doing well in, and you should make sure you push that further because I do think participatory futures is important. And the more we have that, the more resilient societies become because futures is a way of citizens understanding quite how hard the choices that they face are, right? And they suddenly realize, oh, we might have all sorts of ideas, but governing is difficult. And futures can bring that out in a very real way, right? Just by highlighting the tensions, the trade-offs, and the paradoxes that a different view of the future might actually entail. Yeah. So I think we're sustaining it by making sure that, it's like in my case, now that I've left government, I've always tried to help the folks who do futures in this futures collective and in the think tank. So I will probably go and lead this think tank when I finish up at Oxford. So I'm going to grow that capacity where I can. But what I've also insisted on, and I've told my colleagues in government this, is that I don't think they should get too involved in the civil society work. They should be networked into it, but their primary focus should be to do good foresight in government. Because if the same people try and do everything, they end up spreading themselves way too thin. So I think the fact that there's a good base of foresight in government is a good thing. And now some of that talent is trying to spread the word to other parts of the ecosystem. It's interesting because if you look at this Futures Collective group, many of the people who started it were in government, but not all, right? So some encountered futures in other ways. So I'd say it's about a third who are in government and the rest have not been. So it's a nice way of also then spreading the talent through the broader ecosystem rather than trying to have the government do everything on its own.
Okay, thank you very much. Participatory futures is important. I hope my boss is taking notes, Mr. Ebenezer. So I'm open. Yeah, he needs to take notes because I'm actually taking notes as you're speaking. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has questions. We're open to take questions now from the audience.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but just checking if other audience members do before I jump in.
We can do various rounds of questions as well if you
Yes,
want.
please. Yes, please. Okay, sure. So I have a quick question on, so when we spoke to Qatar, the Qatar Foundation, so like referred to the Qatar National Vision 2030, and sort of like different, so Rwanda has the Kigali 2050, like various, governments sort of have a vision book of some sort that they refer to. But it feels like Singapore took a different approach as to not necessarily having a certain book, but having a sort of like infrastructure around foresight. So what's what advice do you have for us? We also looking at having a book because like we think it's quite symbolic, especially for us in our own parts. People love to like see something physically and so like refer to it and stuff like that. So what kind of advice do you have for us from your experience on how Singapore hasn't really had a physical book, but has worked around
Yeah.
visioning, built infrastructure for this? Yeah.
I love that you asked that question, Ebenezer. When I used to be in government, I would often get that question. So we would have visitors from Qatar, from Bahrain, from different parts of the world, and they'd all say, "What is the national vision?" And I'd be like, "Guys, we have no national vision." See, I tell you why we don't do it. We did we when we did those kind of vision statements, we found that the minute you publish them, they become outdated, right? Because the world changes. Um, And so we found that what was more important, the agility, is actually the conversation that leads to that output, right, to the product. And so that's what we wanted to document in the end. So what we have published is what we call national scenarios for the future, right? And we've published a number of those. Some are on the CSF website. You'll have seen them. Um, and the idea is that you capture the different possibilities that are out there and not just a single vision. And then the idea is how do we then develop visions to deal with those different parts of those different possibilities and realities. Now, we found that this has been more useful for us because if you try and do a vision, then you have to kind of shoehorn everything into one document, right? And it just didn't work for us. What we found is every individual agency needed its own vision, and they have vision statements, right? But they do that with reference to the scenarios that have already been prepared. So we found that for us, at least, that was a more sensible system. It was better use of our time and resources. But I do fully agree with you, Ebenezer, that you need something to kind of focus the mind, right? And sometimes the political symbolism of having a report can be a very powerful thing. But what matters is not actually the content, right? What matters is who spoke in the FGDs that led up to your output. And then what conversations are you going to have based on that output? Because if you just submit a document to your government and they say, okay, thank you very much, there's a symbolic handshaking ceremony, and you take some pictures, it gets covered in the media, and you all feel good. That'll be nice. It'll be a win for a day, but it's not going to get you anywhere, right? The real question is what happens after? Do you sit down with the different agencies and have a chat about your piece? Do they come and ask you, based on your 2050 scenarios, what must my ministry do on tourism? What must another agency do on culture? What must another agency do on education? Those are the questions where the rubber will hit the road, right? And that's actually what's most important. So in Singapore, we've tried to focus on that rather than the symbolism of a single product. Yeah. So I wish you well when you try and get to those different groups, because it does
Yeah.
sound like the political
Yeah.
divisions and fractiousness are an obstacle,
Yeah.
right, on that front.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
start where you can, right? Go to the people who will listen and at least have the conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. No, we'll definitely also like have a look at the national scenarios as well for the future as some of the things that we can also cite as a
Yeah.
framework that the state can also like adopt as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I saw that Osma
Yes.
from Brazil had his hand
Mm.
up,
Osmar
and
had
then there's
something
a
to do
question
with
in the chat.
Jurong,
Os-
right, Osmar?
Osma.
Hello,
Oh,
everyone. Hello, Aaron.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
So, I have a question for you
Yeah.
because not a question, but maybe a provocation, kind
Yep.
of. I
I like
was in Brazil.
provocation.
Yeah, I was in Brazil like 10 years ago
Mm.
doing my master degree at the University of Brasilia, and I was working with the water crisis that happened in Brasilia. So I went to talk with the farmers in one of the sub-basins that were really without water, with the really heavy situation in this northeast part of Brasilia. Brasilia is a federal district. It's
Yeah.
like a
Where the
square
capital is, right?
area.
Yeah.
As the capital of Brazil was built, like a new modern city, was planned, everything. So I was there talking with the farmers about the future. So They have seen that water crisis. What is the future for them? And things was going in that way. So the Brazilian government hired Jurong, a Singapore company,
Yes.
and it was a big thing because the government paid like a $50 million dollars for Jurong to come to Brasilia and to plan the future Brasilia in the next 50 years.
Yep.
Okay, there was a big argument. There was a big fight inside the assembly, the local assembly, because of the money. Why Singapore? Because why not Brazilian companies to thinking in Brazilian future? Why is wrong? So wrong is good, is not. What's Singapore? What's the interest of Singapore in Brazil? It was a big thing. But the end of it, the local assembly kicked out Jurong, but the government pays around like $5 million for just the executive summary of it. And the executive summary that Jurong did for Brasilia changed my master degree because in that executive summary, the area that I was studying, the northeast of the Brasilia, would be the new airport, international airport. And the future, so I was collecting the future of these farmers, family farmers. But when the main newspaper in Brasilia released the executive summary, everything changed. Oh, so the Brasilia will receive a new international airport based on the plan of Jerome. So I don't want to keep my farm that way. I want to create like a small um, cage community. I want to create a new like an industry in my area, commerce to provide things for the new airport. So end of story.
Yeah.
The idea is like okay, scenarios can be depend on the weight and but the power that a company has can be also a very disruptive future signal.
Yeah.
That was just the executive summary, no
Yeah.
more than that.
Imagine if they'd done the full thing.
Yeah, imagine
Yeah.
that. And it was really good. That was
Yep.
like save my like I used the executive summary and my thesis was really good. I was approved,
Yeah.
but it left me with that
Yeah.
like a smell of something. What is scenarios for? Like it changed reality before. It's for analyzing reality and changing reality. So
Yeah.
I leave you with this provocation.
Yeah, no, it's a good provocation, and scenarios are meant to be ways of not just looking at what might be out there, right? But also, I think we need to ask ourselves, what are the futures we want, right? Um, I'm not sure who else you're going to speak to, right, in terms of your methodology, for example, but there's this difference between what we call adaptive and activist futures, right? Adaptive futures are futures that we adjust to, right? We say these are all different possibilities, and we figure out what we do to prepare for them. Activist futures are futures where we say that what do we want in the world, right? What serves our interest best? And it does sound like in your case, you are interested in building some of that, right? What are the futures that you should want for River State? And not just the futures that are out there. Not all of it may be possible, of course, because you are one state amongst many. There may be things that lie under the federal government's jurisdiction. All that is true, but I think you can paint this picture. And what I think Osmar is talking about is the fact that we are dealing with in the case of the airport that you talked, that was a vision of what could be, right? And a vision that people wanted to have happen in a much more positive way. Now, the reality, of course, is that a good foresight process has a little bit of both, right? If you're only adaptive, then it can be a very disempowered process because you're not coming up with any new ideas. But if you're only adaptive and saying, if you're only activist rather than saying this is the future we want, then we forget that the future we want is interrelated with many realities, constraints, and independent and dependent variables, right, on what we are already doing. So we do need to balance between the two, I think. But it's a very interesting question because I do think having that sense of a desired future is very important. This links to something that Telema pointed out in the chat, right? Like what should define the vision of a nation or a subnational unit? And I think for me, the most important thing here is a vision is partly also a desired future, but it's also what I would call a stretch future. A division should not be easy to achieve in the next 5 years. If that's achievable, then that should just be your mission statement. You should go about and doing and just get it done. Whereas a really strong vision, I think, sets out what we really want to become, right? As a bit of a stretch goal. And that often will include things like being world class or being a pioneer in various fields. And it must include that element of challenge beyond what we are doing today. But if you have that, then I think that's often a good start to the kind of overall process that you need to have. The other thing that I want to add, based on what Osman mentioned, right, about the Serbana Jurong example, is after the vision, after the scenario, what next, right? And that's where implementation capacity starts to become really important. The reason the Jurong people are able to do what they do, right? In a sense, they are selling a model, right? But the model is not to prescribe and say you must have an airport, you must have a port. I mean, different countries have different requirements, right? Some countries may not be able to do that. Some states may not be able to do that. So the big question is deciding what you want is really something that within your countries you have to do, right? Brazil, Nigeria, or within the states. But what I think the Jurong people can help with is to say, once you've decided what you'd like to do in an informed way, there are then certain capacities that need to be built up in order to allow for implementation with fidelity. And that I think is where there are interesting capabilities that can be brought up, right? So that's where systems should not be corrupt. You need a good HR system to hire the right talent. You've got to have the right technical systems in place. You might bring in technical advisors when that's necessary. Singapore had technical advisors from the World Bank for the first 20 years of our industrialization plan. Those capacities then become important because you have to be able to implement. Otherwise, going back to what I said earlier, the vision remains a paper document rather than something that is living and breathing.
Well, okay, so this answers Mr. Telema's question. I can see a hand up. Mr. Jojo, or is it Miss Jojo Odokama? I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, this is definitely a miss. Okay, Frank, no worries. And thank you so much, Mr. Aaron. The insights that you've shared, I think that we definitely would hold on to. And I think that you may have touched on a few parts of the question that I'd like to maybe frame into 2-3 questions.
Okay.
So I mean, and maybe just as a background, I think it's necessary to maybe just confirm, around your background where you had served in public service, but at the same time, were you a politician? Because I know that they're two different things.
Never.
Somebody can
Never
be a politician and also serve in public service.
I was never a politician. I've always been in civil service, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm not sure how you then answer this question because I'd like to think that we come from a state or a climate where we would say that we are pretty much fragile.
Right.
And considering, and this applies to several things, especially with regards the political instability. Was there every other day there would I call them tribal tensions or community versus state tensions? The institutions are getting weaker every other day.
Yep.
And I know that Singapore also had come from a relatively low corruption governance.
Mm-hmm.
But for a state like ours, where we're literally running with short-term survival, I mean, I suppose properly, the government actually listening to citizens and taking in what matters to them most, and using that to actually transform the state, even with all the resources that the state has. So from Singapore's story in the early nation building days, say from the 1960s all the way to 1970s, what would you say are some of the lessons that we can adopt and apply to our context as a fragile state?
I really like that question. I think that probably the most important, right? Well, three quite critical things. One is where there is corruption, I think you need to try and find ways to eradicate that as fast as you can, as comprehensively as possible. No one ever does this perfectly, right? Corruption is difficult to remove, but I think you need to start there, because if you don't have that, then lots of efforts will just kind of fall into like a black hole. It sucks a lot of energy, but you won't actually get output coming out of it. It also affects funding, right? Because a lot of international funders will be looking for whether a system is likely to be extractive and rapacious about the resources that they pour in. And you're not likely to get support from a UNDP or even an international philanthropic donor if they don't think that the support they give is going to land for the outcomes that they're interested in. So I think corruption is one key aspect. I would focus on building up the education system as much as you can, because if you have that, then again, if people know that you have talent, they are likely to want to invest in you, and so that that talent can thrive further. Very few people want to do projects where they are having to drive everything, right? They will want to find local partners. And so you have to build that talent. And if the talent isn't being built in the public sector or by the public sector, then entities like your 2050 project can actually be a useful way of also building up some of that capacity. So those two things I think are critical. The third thing is that I think in policy making, it's important to be as pragmatic and as unideological as possible. And again, this is hard. I get it. It is not an easy thing to have to do, but I think it's actually really important. One of the things that are useful for Singapore is where we take big bets. We always take bets based on evidence and and what might work and what's necessary for the country, rather than what's someone's ideological preference. So in the 60s and 70s, we faced a big choice, right? When we became a country, we had to ask ourselves, how do we grow the economy? We don't have an internal market, at least not much of one. We don't have a lot of space, as we saw on the map that Ebenezer shared earlier. And we had to figure out how to deal with those constraints. And there were two paths that available at the time, right? The dominant economic wisdom in the 60s and 70s was do import substitution. Basically protect your economy, right? Don't go into free trade. Don't do things like open your economy to international capital and finance, because those things were seen as dangerous, as kind of impositions of a capitalist West. And so many countries did not do that, right? Like Pakistan, for instance, or parts of India. We looked at it and said, well, we get that theory, but we're a small open economy and we have no internal market. If we protect our markets against external trade, there's nothing left to do, because there's only at the point there were only like 2 million Singaporeans. I mean, now we have almost 6, but even that is still a very small market. So that's an example, I think, of extremely pragmatic policy making, right? And saying we're going to go against the dominant wisdom here, but we have to, because that's what's going to help us survive. We will not be able to survive if we go down the import substitution protectionist path. So what do? We opened ourselves to free trade. We have pretty much zero tariffs, including now. The Americans have imposed 10% tariffs on us, but we've not retaliated because it just serves no one's purpose. And then on the financial and capital market side, we've opened ourselves to international direct investment pretty much freely. I mean, there's controls, right, in terms of who comes in and when, and the government is also careful about making sure that we get some benefit from that process, right? So we will only support international investment coming into Singapore if we know that the fixed asset investment is going to be high, and that the kind of the manpower and job creation is also going to be significant. But I think that kind of pragmatism is actually quite key. So if you put those together, right, corruption, focus on education, and whatever policies are in place, especially the economic ones, being pragmatic, hopefully that helps.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you answered her question. And I have one question for you
Sure.
before Oh, okay. I have one more question before Mr. Ebenezer comes up. What
Yeah.
what policy area do you believe African governments are currently under investing in? Because Africa is basically a country, like everything. It's basically almost the same thing across board in Africa. So what policy do you think we're under investing in?
That is such an interesting. I'm not sure I am expert enough to give you a view on this.
I'll take
You
it
know,
now.
you know your view, your realities much more than I do. But if I had to pick, I would actually, well, I would identify the first two things again, right? Anti-corruption and education. I don't think you're investing enough in those areas. There's a small elite that comes to places like Oxford, but I'm not sure that the benefits of that are percolating back because many of them stay in London, right? Or they don't come home and transfer the insights indigenously. So those two things are definitely part of it. Um, there was one more. Oh, the third bit was digital. I do think you need to invest even more on the digital technology side of things, and many parts of your government are, right? um, when you do that, you also allow yourself to harness the new possibilities that come from technological development. And in a lot of instances, I don't think it's just about slavishly aping the rest of the world and going through the same path that they did. But digital allows you to completely leapfrog what's going on. I mean, countries that didn't have telephone lines could go straight into wireless, right? And now into things like 4G, and I think you should be focusing on that. I would focus on what 4G allows you to do with AI, for instance, and build your education system with AI rather than trying to do everything in a linear path that imitates, the Americans or Europe or anything else. So yeah, digital technology I think becomes really key also.
I saw somewhere that your work intersects with
Yeah,
digital policy
that's
and
right.
that.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
but I know Mr. Ebenezer wants to ask a few questions. I don't know if he's
right.
ready now.
Yeah, let's just take Udo's questions. Udo, come on, you have one more question to ask, and then I'll ask two questions to Dr. Aaron, and then we would have the final question, and we'll wrap up. So, Udo, do you have?
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Actually, Mr. Aaron just keeps delving more and more into different areas, and I mean, questions are springing up the more that you speak. But I'll just try to maybe just wrap up my own question section this time
Okay.
around. But please permit me, it may come in as another one or two questions in one.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one will be, I mean, we're building or even like what formulating a long-term vision here, and obviously Singapore and a few other countries who smaller what territories who moved from their chaos or chaotic what's state at that time now transformed now into where they are. Um,
Yeah.
and would like to we usually use these examples because, to be very honest, that's where our state is at. I don't know
Mm.
if both Ebenezer or Dr. Ann had shared the state of things. Currently, it's so many things, too numerous to mention at this point. So when you
Yeah.
even you touched around corruption, which is what's the big elephant in the room.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I mean, how do we even slightly curb that? But let's just keep that aside. Now we're literally building a long-term project here, and Singapore obviously did the same. I'd like to ask if in between trying to implement or execute that long-term vision, was there any disruption in between, and how did the country come back from whatever that disruption was? At the beginning of your introduction or something like that, you did mention that as a small country, you obviously are also vulnerable to
Yep.
different shocks, global shocks, economically or socially.
Yeah.
Maybe you can infuse that into your response
Yeah.
to
No,
just
definitely, Udo.
cite
Yeah.
a few
Sorry.
times where there was a halt in executing now the long-term vision that the country had developed,
Yeah.
and how did you come back from that disruption? And
Yeah.
then maybe just wrap it up with, I mean, usually when people set out to build or to create long-term visions like what we're doing, you'd usually have some mistakes here and there. I'd
Mm.
like you to point out some of those mistakes that happened either during the development of that long-term vision or plan, or at the point of implementation? Were there any mistakes that you'd like to point out, and maybe also summarize that now with some of the success stories of things that's happened in terms of
Okay.
anyway, so yeah, that's
Yeah.
my
So answer
those are my
everything basically,
questions.
Udo. Okay, we can take a stab at it. They're big questions, but Ebenezer, why don't you come in as well, and then we can take all three.
Okay, sure. So my own questions were more, I had two questions. One was on infrastructural development, and I think you touched a bit on this, talking about like how the World Bank was in Singapore for like 20 years supporting some of the work. So I think just to know what were some of the tactics and strategies that Singapore used to fast track infrastructural development, because I think for one country that happened really fast, like it seemed like a really fast thing in a very short time. So how were you able to do that? And then the second question was to know if Singapore had a sovereign wealth fund, and how Singapore sort of like manages it, because I know like your sovereign wealth fund is probably one of the biggest in the world. So how do you manage that? Because we think River States needs like a futures fund of some sorts, where proceeds from the sale of fossil fuels can sort of like come in there to help invest in other parts of the economy to diversify our economy. Because currently we're like a hydrocarbon economy. If oil stops now, everything shuts down. So how do we ensure that we're able to do that? And how did Singapore do that as well with tourism and the rest of that? So those are my questions. Sorry, a lot of questions, but
Yeah, they're great. Yeah, like
yeah.
you're asking me to write the Singapore manual here. But they're all good questions, and I'm happy to invest some time in them. So first of all, Udo's question on coming back from disruption, right? Udo, everything is a disruption for a place like Singapore. I mentioned many examples earlier on, right? So just going back a few years now, right? Now we've got the Straits of Hormuz, 2009. Well, there was COVID, of course. 2009, the global financial crisis that had a very long tail after that. 9/11, 2011, the 2003 severe acute respiratory syndrome crisis in Singapore, which was a kind of regional epidemic, not quite a global pandemic. 1997, the Asian financial crisis, kind of the crash of Thailand and then Indonesia, partly after, kind of being having their currency had a run on it based on George Soros's outfits. So he's not the most popular man in many parts of Southeast Asia. All of those are examples of disruption. So, disruption we kind of think of it in Singapore as just par for the course. We have to learn how to adjust and deal with them. So there's two aspects to this, right? One is how do you cushion against the disruption as much as you can? And in some of those cases, like the 2009 GFC and COVID, we actually dipped into our national reserves. We don't normally do that. Our government has commitments such that each new government must raise its own revenue. Each new term of government must raise revenue. It cannot dip into the reserves. If it wants to dip into the reserves, Parliament must approve and the President must also approve. So there are checks and balances on that. And the idea is that but if you do it judiciously, that spending from reserves can help you to come back to basically cushion against the effects of the crisis, such that people don't end up suffering too much in terms of job losses, for instance. But what it also allows you to do is to then, at the recovery phase, recover faster. So if you look at the examples of COVID, like Singapore was affected as a global place, right? As we were with the 2009 financial crisis, but we also recovered much faster than most places because we didn't allow companies to shave off jobs, right? We said to them, you've got to keep the jobs so that when recovery comes, we can ride those wins fast. And I think that's something that we will always try and commit to doing. It allows us, I guess, to make those responses in as agile a way as possible. It's the same thing now with AI, right? Where we're not trying to preserve jobs in an artificial way, but we are saying to companies, we're supporting you, go and train your people. After that, if you've trained them and they still can't do the job, then yes, get rid of them, right? But you need to train them and allow them to have a fighting chance to deal with the challenges that are out there. And of course, the challenge of AI is a very different kind of challenge compared to the GFC or to COVID. But the broad spirit is the same, which is prepare people, spend the money on creating the supply side capabilities so that when the crisis is over, or when you have learned enough to manage the crisis, you're able to ride the waves of the opportunities that are there. Udo asked about mistakes as well. And again, every system makes mistakes. I think one of our gravest mistakes was what we call our stop at two population policy. Back in the 80s, we kind of bought into the kind of ideas of the Malthusian assumption of the world, right? To say, well, the carrying capacity of Earth is not as high, so we better start controlling our populations a bit more, right? This was what came out of the Malthusian approach to things. And then, of course, later on, the Club of Rome report came along and said, oh, well, maybe you didn't have to do that quite as much, but we had already taken those steps, right? And the problem with taking steps to say stop at two is once you've said something like that, as the Chinese have discovered, it's very hard to undo that, right? Because it seeps into the local consciousness and psyche, and people just have fewer children. So at the moment, our total fertility rate is 0.87, right? Which is really, really low, right? So couples are not replacing themselves. We don't actually have enough people to power the economy. And the solution to that has to be immigration. But you also then have to make sure that your immigration does not destabilize your social cohesion. Right, so we put all of those things together as much as we can, and it's a very difficult tension to manage. So that was a major mistake, I think, and it's one that we now have to recover from, right? Because I don't think we paid attention enough to the fact that there would be this long tail of demographic transition as we put in place a policy like that. Most countries, as they mature, have fewer babies anyway, but we accelerated that, right? And I think we made it go to a lower point than would have happened if we let the evolution be much more organic. Another example of a mistake is probably our policy on bilingualism. We used to insist that everybody in school has to learn English and what we call a mother tongue to a very, very high level of bilingual proficiency. And I think what we've realized is a lot of kids don't have that capacity. They can learn about languages in a kind of in a way that allows them to be culturally aware of Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, which are the key languages we teach. But I think to expect them to go to be almost equal in how they deal with English and that mother tongue is very hard. Some people manage it, right? The people who are linguistically inclined, but most of us normal human beings are not able to do that. And so we've evolved that policy as well. We still keep the learning of the language for cultural reasons, but we don't insist on everybody reaching exactly the same level of kind of tip-top proficiency. And this was something to go back to Lee Kuan Yew, right, which was your question. And Lee Kuan Yew himself said that, yeah, my assumptions about bilingualism were wrong, and I needed to update them. Basically, the assumption that everybody would be able to perform to the same level on both. So you can be bilingual and that you might be functional in one and very good in another. But to expect everybody to be functionally literate in both is actually a very tall order. Then Ebenezer, your question about the World Bank, right? And really you were asking about where funds come from, right? Hence the aspect of sovereign wealth funds. I think that's actually a really important question. We did set up, Temasek and GIC, our two sovereign wealth funds, which have slightly different time scales that they focus on. But we set them up quite early on in our nation building. Not quite in 1965, but they've been there for a while. And in both cases, they needed money, right? So where does the money come from? So we started something in the early stages of Singapore's development that we called the Central Provident Fund. And this is basically where 20% of everybody's salary, and I really mean everybody, gets put into a national, like an account, basically. You can take it out when you retire, but we put that in there because it allowed the state basically to nationalize some of those resources, which provided investment funds. So the more those funds grow, then actually that adds to government reserves as well, right? So that gave us a kind of strategic bank, literally, of funding that could be used to grow our eventual long-term capacities. What I would add is that, we're very lucky that we did that when we did, right? Because we did it when we became independent, and therefore everyone understood, okay, it's a bit urgent. We're in this situation of dire, emergency almost, because we've just left the Malaysian Federation, and we don't have any internal capabilities, or internal market rather. And so I think the population was also a bit less educated at the time. They were more willing to go through and say, all right, if the government says this is it, then it probably is a good idea. If we try to introduce compulsory savings today, which is essentially what that model is, I don't think it would work. I'll be honest. I really don't. And it's not a criticism of anybody. It's just natural human politics is such that once you have a much more sophisticated citizenry, they will oppose this kind of move. So the two big moves that we made that I think were very important for our long term were one, Central Provident Fund, and the other was a national conscript army, right? Where we said that it is mandatory for all able-bodied males to do national military service for, at that point, 2.5 years. Then now it became two more recently. If we try to do that today, there's no way people would agree. But we were lucky we did it early on, and now it's there. You know, it's what I'd like to call path dependency in policy, right? What you set in place in the early stages will end up persisting in later stages. Scientists understand this, right? That's what laboratory conditions are all about. So in our case, we were lucky that we put those early conditions in at the start.
Thank you. Thank
Well, thank you so much. A lot to unpack here. And finally, Dr. Maniam, this is a question we ask all guests
Yeah.
who come to Rivers Vision 2050 platform. With what you have learned about River State and the possibilities you experience in Singapore within a short period, where would you imagine River State can get to over the next 25 years if we get our foresight and implementation right?
You know, it seems to me that the most important thing here is how you harness your civil society, right? I'm excited for you because this is a project that allows you to harness the energy of citizens, right? Regardless of what politics allows you to do, you are trying to harness that energy. And I think that is a positive thing because ultimately you will need some element of politics to be involved, right? You need the bureaucracy, you need the capability that governments have to implement and operationalize. But I think what we're seeing in the world today, especially in the school I teach in, is government alone cannot do everything, right? It needs the energy of other sectors, right? What in some circles we like to call multi-stakeholder approaches, right? And what's exciting about your work is it is by default multi-stakeholder. You're not having to learn bad habits, right, of the government trying to do everything on its own. You are trying to bypass and hack that system almost, right? In the tech entrepreneur sense of hack, not the cybersecurity sense of hack. And I'm excited for you in terms of what you can do there because I think, you know, when we harness citizen energy, there's something very, very powerful that can emerge from that. I don't know whether you've heard that old quote, you know, about what happens when small groups of citizens get together. Have you all come across that before? You
No,
probably have,
no.
no? So it's from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has, right? So it's easy to get discouraged when you think that the government is blocking what you're trying to do. But actually, it's precisely civic movements that end up catalyzing and eventually sustaining long-term social and political transformation. Of course, it will take time and it can take a huge amount of energy as well. But the fact is that you're starting and the fact that you are working with one another, right, trying to build a new kind of coalition that is not politically motivated, that I think can only be powerful. So I'm very excited for where it will go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'd hand over now to Mr. Ebenezer to close it. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. We really, I mean, this basically was if I would say, masterclass on like sharing the lessons from Singapore and everything that's happened and the experience that you've also brought as well. Thanks to everyone that has joined. Yeah, let me just share just a few announcements before we close. All of the insights that Dr. Maniam has shared with us would go into the Rivers 2050 Vision book. Would share, of course, final draft versions before we finally go to print. So Dr. Maniam, you'll definitely hear from us sometime in August, late August, with all of the information before we go to print. Just for those who are joining us for the first time, our website, rivers2050.org, has all the information about the project and what we're trying to achieve. We also have a couple of AI visual features as well that we created, sort of like trying to build visual scenarios of what we think River State can look like. They look really interesting. I think you should check them out. So please do well to go to our website and see what they look like. All of the recordings as well, including today's session, would be on our YouTube as well, youtube.com/Arts Policy Shapers. Do well to check that out as well. River State is celebrating its 59th anniversary on May 27th. So we've started from today doing a radio tour across almost all of the radio stations, I think 13 of them in town. We'll be sharing information about this on the WhatsApp group, but also across social media as well. So please do also check out. For those who are in River State, would love to listen to the conversations on radio. On the 27th, we're hosting a virtual panel, bringing together young people in politics, in academia, in business, environment, civil society, tech, etc., to come talk about the future of the states. The discussion is tagged River State at 59, what next? So please, that's at 6 p.m. West Africa time. We'll share the link as well for people who love to join the conversation. Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks, Dr. Maniam. We really appreciate you. We can't say thank you enough.
Can I
And
say
thanks to
one
members.
thing, Ebenezer? I'm sorry, just listening to your announcements prompted one more
Yes,
thought. I
yes,
know we're
please.
officially about to end, but I'll just share this with you, which is anniversaries can be a very powerful thing to try and mobilize when you do good futures. So if you're 59 now, start laying the foundations for what River State 60 will look like, right? And in that 60th anniversary, so when you go to the politicians with your vision document, don't just say, we want to talk about this. Ask them, what can we do with you to celebrate the 60th milestone and anniversary, that jubilee, right? Because no matter how, and I'm not passing any judgment on any of your politicians here, but whether they're wonderful or corrupt, all politicians love the opportunity to kiss babies. They all love the opportunity to celebrate anniversaries, right? If you can get them on board to help celebrate that anniversary and maybe plan a series of, X number of events to talk about your report, I think that could be really powerful. So Rivers 2050, celebrating River at 60, right? So what does that look like? I would really try and frame that in terms of the anniversary where possible, because you will find that you will get good mileage out of it.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll definitely
Great.
take of that and leverage it. And thanks to the NGFP community as well that joined in. Thanks a lot, folks. Have a great rest of your day and see you online. Yeah. All right. Bye.
Okay, good luck, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.